So we're going to move a little bit inlands from the last talk. We're going to talk about categorized behaviors of Lake Sturgeon and the Niagara River. And so Lake Sturgeon are, generally people think about Lake Sturgeon in the Laurentian Great Lakes, although they also inhabit the Mississippi drainage as well as the Hudson Bay drainage. And then here in New York, there are 4 spawning populations, 3 of which are in Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence, but I'm here to talk to you about the one on the Niagara River here. So the Niagara River flows from Lake Erie, northwards from Lake Erie, splits around Grand Island, goes over Niagara Falls, and then out into Lake Ontario. And so we're really interested in the population below Niagara Falls. It's an impassable barrier. Technically, there is the Welland Canal to the west, but we don't think they're using it. That's a whole different discussion. However, in the Niagara River, Lake Sturgeon come in from Lake Ontario to spawn in mid to late spring in the area we call the Niagara Gorge. It's where the Niagara Falls is kind of eroded backwards and create this really deep, fast-moving canyon. And so once they spawn, they will then return back to Lake Ontario. That's the general model. However, in some cases, some sturgeon take their time getting back, and others don't even leave at all, it seems. So we're interested in why there's this differences in behavioral patterns and what that could mean for conservation as well, and different habitat utilization. So to do that, we capture sturgeon. We mainly use set lines in the lower river. If we use gill nets, they'll oftentimes get blown out or just full of Cladophora. It's a mess. So once we capture Lake Sturgeon, we've been taking blood samples, we've been pit tagging them, length, weight, taking genetic samples. But the main thing we're talking about today is these acoustic tags. So this is yet another acoustic telemetry talk. So I'm going to kind of explain how acoustic telemetry works a little bit. I mean, there's been a lot of talks about it, but the background's a little bit important for this. So you tag a sturgeon. We have tags in the last 10 years. That lasts about 10 years. They'll ping every 30 seconds to 3 minutes randomly. So these pings will be picked up by our receivers, and then we use that information, in some cases, triangulate their position. So in the Niagara River, we have an array that looks like this. And so each one of these black points is one of our receivers. So we have, and so for years and years, we get data from these detections. And so in, say, a 15-minute time span, you could have 5 detections on one receiver, 3 on another, 2 on another, 1 on another, and we use those to calculate what's called a center of activity. So we essentially trilaterate their position. It's a position estimate. It's not where they are for sure, but it's an estimate. And so everything from here on out is based on these center of activity calculations. So in a given day, we could have, many of these center of activity estimates. So we then take those and assign them to a part of the river. So or in this case, the lake. So they're in Lake Ontario, the Niagara River, or Niagara Gorge. Niagara Gorge, once again, being that area we think that they're spawning. Mind you, there are also other models on one of this with maybe 4 or 5 different zone assignments, but this one made the most sense. So, in a given day, there are a bunch of these zone assignments, and what we do is we take those and we summarize that down into a daily river utilization. So, in a given day, the most common location we found them, in this case, was in the river. So then we did that for 72 fish times 1,600 days. It's about 120,000 data points to work with, which is pretty nice, I won't lie. So what does that look like? We can generate a plot, an abacus plot that looks like this. This is kind of going to be the basis of a lot of the stuff we're seeing as well. So let me break this down for you. Each row is a unique fish, and each point is showing, once again, that zone, lake, river, gorge, zone assignment. And so, just looking at this now, you can see patterns that really will leap out to you. You know, they're going into the gorge, right? A lot of them are going to the gorge at that spawning season. However, they're not all the same. There is definitely there are these differences in behavioral patterns, and we want to know why, and this is where we're going. So to kind of cluster out, group these behavioral patterns, there's two different types of clustering. The first is from right to left. You start with all these fish, you assume that they are different, and then you pull them together. That's a collaborative clustering. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to work under the assumption that these fish are all behaving similarly, and then split them out. That's divisive clustering. So how do you do this? Essentially, you create a table very similar to what we were seeing with that abacus plot before. Each row is an individual animal, and each column is your date. And so what you're looking at is you have to calculate pairwise differences. And so each of these values is just a zone assignment. 2 is a river, 3 is the lake. And you add up those differences over time, all of them for each individual pair of fish, and you create Manhattan distance. And so you throw that into a fancy table, and then you run your clustering algorithm. And we got something that looks like this. So right away, from our divisive clustering analysis, the most significant way to look at this, there are 2 behavioral groups. However, I'm getting a little hand wavy with the stats in here, but this is the most significant. However, if you look at the figure here, it may make more sense biologically. Where they start really breaking out more frequently is looking at 6 behavioral groups. So, what does that actually look like? So here's our abacus plot from before, unsorted. So when you take those behavioral patterns and overlay that dendrogram, what you get is something that looks like this. So the black line is showing that when you break that out at 2 groups, the dark black line shows when you break out at 2 groups, and the other remaining lines kind of show your breaks between the other 6. So a couple things will pop out to you right away. The first being that some of them seem to be completely lake resident. So the upper ones, the lower ones, they're much more river resident. That is that gray coloration. Some of them have are much more likely, it seems, to stay in the gorge. And in some cases, there's, like the top group here, there's no cyclical pattern. Some of them will go in the gorge, some area, the spawning area, and some of them won't. And so here's just another way to look at that information. I apologize, that last grouping a little loud because there's 1 fish in it. So of course, proportion of the time used is going to be 100% for everything it does. But once again, you have lake migrant groups, there are lake resident groups, river resident groups, and just one that's just migrant all over the place, and it's just doing its own thing. So we wanted to figure out why are some of these behavioral patterns, like some reasoning behind these. So the first thing we looked at was age, and there is no significant difference in age. So the next thing we looked at was weight, and there's a significant difference. So it seems to be that large lake resident group is much smaller individuals than the ones in that river resident group. The second thing we looked at was length, just total length, and the same thing. Those river resident populations, subpopulation is larger than the ones in that second group. And so the last thing I looked at was sex ratios. This one's a little difficult. We're still working on this one. We still have genetic samples that we are waiting to get processed. Thanks, Buff State. University of Buffalo. Oops, I apologize. Sorry, Chris. Anywho, so we're waiting to get these animals sexed properly, and there's no significant difference right now. The significance value is very, very close, but I think we're going to be able to get a much better idea of what's going on once we get those samples processed. But it does look like there's a really high proportion of our males are in that second group, that smaller, lighter group. And so the last thing I'll show you is kind of just looking at those last two movement behavioral groups, is that smaller group appears to be so 90% lake resident. They seem to be shorter, they're lighter, and we think they're a combination of immature females, immature males. That might account for why there's maybe no significant differences in age in other cases, because you have those mature males mixed in with those immature females. And then the other group being this river resident, we think they're longer, they're heavier, and they're mostly female. We think those are likely mature females. So, conclusions. We confirmed that we confirmed our suspicions of divergent resident and migratory behaviors, and we kind of have revealed these expected and unrecognized movement behaviors. So we expected there were some fish that were doing different behaviors, but we didn't really think there would be this many. Now we're able to explain maybe a little bit why they could be doing these different behavioral patterns. We're still working on it, so this is kind of early on. Once we get that sexing data, I think we'll be good to go. And moving forward, that genetic sexing of lake sturgeon is really easy, apparently. With the analysis for that came out in the last couple of years, and it's a simple PCR test. So hopefully get those soon, once we find all our samples. Fight for them back. And upcoming, we also have a couple other telemetric projects in some of the other other rivers of Lake Ontario. So ours is on the left, so that's the Niagara River. We also work with the USGS and DEC in the Genesee River, Oswego River, and Black River. And I would be remiss not to thank our partners and 9 years of staff. And we're out of time, but if you have any questions, please let me know. And reach out to me if you have any questions or want to do a similar study on zone assignments, because this is what I've been thinking about for months.